My son-in-law didn't know I owned $5 billion worth of shares in his father's company. To him, I was just a quiet old man in a worn jacket, cheap, easy to ignore. He loved that story. Then one Friday he invited me to dinner with his parents. I said yes, because I wanted to see how they'd treat a poor old man right up until Reginald slid a thick envelope across the table. 5 minutes later, the room went dead silent. To understand why that envelope was the last mistake they ever made, let me take you back a few days. My name is Leonard Whitfield. I'm 67 years old, retired civil engineer, widower. For the past 6 years, I've lived alone in a small wooden house on a half-acre lot along the South Fork River outside Chicago. Margaret, my wife, picked that spot herself. She walked every available lot in a 3-county area over 8 months before she settled on this one. Said it was the right one because you could hear the water from the kitchen window. She bought the land with money she saved working double shifts at a textile plant while I was building up our engineering firm. We put the house up together on weekends over 2 summers. Every board in that place has her hands on it somewhere. To my son-in-law, it was an obstacle. Reginald Osworth had married my daughter, Nadine, 6 years ago. I showed up at the wedding in a rented suit and drove home in a 10-year-old pickup. By that point, I had already been the majority shareholder of his father's company for over 2 decades, but neither of them knew that. Reginald saw what he expected to see, a working-class old man with calloused hands in a modest house, someone to be tolerated at holidays and ignored the rest of the time. That was fine with me. Margaret and I had built our lives quietly. We didn't need anyone to know what we had. We just needed to keep building. Back in 1994, Howard Dunmore, Reginald's father, had founded Osworth Construction on the strength of 2 city contracts and a lot of confidence. By the time Reginald was in grade school, Howard had expanded into commercial development, industrial builds, the whole range. But around 1994, a bad land deal in Ohio wiped out a significant portion of the company's reserves. Howard had over-leveraged, the deal collapsed, and Osworth Construction was roughly 3 weeks from filing bankruptcy. Howard needed a silent partner. He needed someone with capital who wouldn't ask for a seat at the table, who would let him keep running the company and save face. My engineering firm had done well over 20 years. Margaret and I had saved carefully. We had built up enough that we could put in $280 million for a 51% controlling stake without destroying ourselves financially. It was most of what we had, but we believed in the fundamentals of the business and we believed Howard could stabilize it if he had the runway. We drew up the agreement through Clifford Hartley, my attorney at the time, and we kept it quiet. Howard knew, his lawyers knew, Clifford knew, nobody else did. Over the next 30 years, Osworth Construction grew. Chicago kept building. The company landed contracts for commercial towers, waterfront redevelopments, infrastructure projects across the Midwest. That $280 million stake, compounded through 30 years of growth and reinvestment, was now valued at just over $5 billion. Howard's son had been running the company as CEO for 4 years and had never once asked who LW Capital was. It started on a Tuesday. Reginald called and said he wanted to catch up over coffee at his office. In 6 years of marriage to Nadine, the man had never once asked to catch up with me. I drove downtown in my pickup and rode the elevator to the 22nd floor. His office was the kind of place designed to make you feel small, glass everywhere, city view in every direction. He had me sit in a low chair across from a desk that cost more than a car, and then his phone rang and he stepped out to take the call in the hallway. That's when I saw it. His laptop was open on the side table next to the window. The screen was still lit. An email thread was pulled up and the subject line read, Riverside, Legacy, Final Barrier. I didn't touch the laptop. I leaned forward in my chair and read from where I sat. His project manager had written, the Whitfield parcel is the only remaining obstacle. The access road to the full development runs directly through that property. Without it, the entire northern section is landlocked, and the Tokyo investors will not commit. We need a resolution on the old man's lot before end of quarter. Below that, Reginald had replied, work every angle. Offers, pressure, whatever it takes. That property does not leave the table. I took out my phone, the old one with the cracked corner, and I photographed the screen. Then I set the phone back in my jacket pocket and folded my hands in my lap and waited for Reginald to come back. When he walked in, I smiled and told him the view was something else. He smiled back and agreed. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing. He said he wanted to make sure I was doing all right out there on my own. Said Nadine worried about me. Said if I ever needed anything, I shouldn't hesitate to ask. I said I appreciated that. I drove home and called Clifford before I even got out of the truck. Clifford Hartley had been my attorney for 22 years. He handled everything from Margaret's estate to the LW Capital accounts to the annual shareholder filings that nobody at Osworth Construction ever seemed curious enough to trace back. He was 60 years old, steady as a load-bearing wall. and he had never once panicked in a situation that warranted it. I told him what I had seen on the laptop. I told him about the email and the phrase work every angle. I told him I expected an invitation to dinner before the end of the week. Clifford was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You want me to pull clause 17? Get everything ready," I said. Termination paperwork for the CEO, full asset freeze, emergency board meeting. I want it all drafted and sitting on your desk by Thursday night. Consider it done. Anything else? Yeah, find out who else on the board has been unhappy with Reginald's leadership. I want allies in that room before I walk in. He said he would make some calls. I spent Wednesday the way I usually do. I drove out to the lot behind the house and split firewood for an hour. I made a sandwich and ate it at the kitchen table looking out at the river. I went through some old files in the back room, the ones from the early days of the engineering firm back when Margaret and I were working out of a converted garage and taking whatever contracts we could get. There's a photo in one of those folders, Margaret and I standing in front of our first completed project, a small pedestrian bridge over a drainage canal in Cicero. She's laughing at something I said. I don't remember what. I've looked at that photo 100 times and I still can't remember. But I remember the way she looked at every project we finished. Like she was personally proud of every rivet in it. That land along the South Fork was hers the same way that bridge was hers. She earned it, she chose it. She planted those trees along the east fence line herself, one per year for the first 10 years. Reginald's project manager had called it a barrier. His boss had called it an obstacle. Neither one of them had ever stood on that lot at 6 in the morning and watched the fog come off the water. Thursday night, I sat at the old desk in the back room and opened the folder Clifford had sent over. The original shareholder agreement from 1994. The amendment filings from 2003 and 2011. The Clause 17 provision, which gave the majority shareholder the right to trigger an emergency board review and immediate executive suspension in the event of conduct that constituted a breach of fiduciary duty or criminal conspiracy. I read through it carefully, the way I always read contracts, line by line, not skipping anything. Then I set it aside and picked up my phone and turned on the voice recorder. I set it on the desk and spoke into it clearly and slowly. A summary of what I had seen in Reginald's office on Tuesday, the email subject line, the text of the message, the reply Reginald had sent. I wanted a dated record of my own account before any of it got complicated. Then I turned the recorder off and went to bed. Nadine called Friday morning. I was out back checking the rain gauge when the phone rang. Her voice had that careful, practiced quality, the kind you hear when someone has rehearsed what they're going to say but hasn't fully committed to believing it yet. She said she hoped I was doing well. She said Reginald's parents were in town for the weekend and that everyone thought it would be nice to have a family dinner. She said she had been meaning to do this for a while. She said it would be good for all of us to sit down together. I said that sounded fine. What time? 7 o'clock, she said. And then after a pause, she said I should maybe wear something nice. She said it the way people say things when they're embarrassed to be saying them. I told her not to worry about it. After we hung up, I stood in the backyard for a while with the phone in my hand. The river was up a little from the rain earlier in the week. A heron was working the shallows about 50 yards downstream. I watched it for a few minutes. I had known this dinner was coming since Tuesday. I had 4 days to decide how I wanted to handle it, and I had spent those 4 days getting every piece of paper in order, every recording time-stamped, every legal instrument cocked and ready. I wasn't angry the way I might have been at 40. At 67, you've seen enough to know that anger is just energy, and energy is only useful if you point it somewhere. I went inside and pressed the voice recorder on my phone to make sure it was working. Then I put on the brown jacket, the worn one that Nadine always winced at, and I called a cab. I wanted to arrive looking exactly like what Reginald expected me to be. The cab dropped me off at the Winnetka address at 5 minutes to 7. The house was lit up from every window, the kind of place that looks like a magazine spread from the outside. Stone driveway, manicured hedges, a front door that probably cost more than my first car. I stood on the step for a moment and checked that the voice recorder on my phone was running. It was. Gloria Dunmore opened the door before I could knock. She was 68 years old and had spent most of those years perfecting the art of making people feel unwelcome while maintaining the appearance of hospitality. She looked me over from the jacket to the shoes, taking her time about it, and then she smiled the way people smile when they want you to know the smile costs them something. "Leonard, you found the place all right." I told her I had no trouble. The living room was the kind of space designed to remind you that you were a guest in someone else's world. Everything was white or glass or chrome. Nadine was standing near the fireplace with a wine glass she wasn't drinking from, turning it slowly by the stem. She looked up when I came in, and the expression on her face was hard to read. Part relief, part dread. The look of someone who is committed to a plan and is no longer sure it was a good one. Howard Dunmore was already seated. 74 years old, thick white mustache, the posture of a man who had spent decades expecting rooms to arrange themselves around him. He stood when I entered, which surprised me a little, and shook my hand firmly. "Leonard, good to see you." I said the same. Reginald came in from the back hallway a minute later, jacket on, phone in hand, the version of himself he wore to impress people. He clapped me on the shoulder like we were old friends and said he was glad I could make it. He asked if I wanted a drink. I said water was fine. Dinner was served at a long table set for 5. The food was good. Gloria had arranged caterers. We had roast salmon, some kind of grain salad, good bread. The conversation stayed on safe ground for the first 40 minutes. The weather, Howard's recent golf trip to Scottsdale, a charity event Gloria had chaired in October. Reginald asked me how the house was holding up, and I said it was solid, built to last. He smiled at that. He didn't know I meant something by it. Nadine barely spoke. She pushed food around her plate and refilled her wine twice and kept her eyes on the table. Once during a pause in the conversation, she glanced over at me and I saw something flicker in her face, something close to an apology, but she looked away before it could form into anything real. After the plates were cleared, Reginald reached under his chair. He placed a manila envelope on the table beside my plate. Next to it, Gloria set down a glossy brochure with a photograph of a sunlit common room on the cover. Elderly people playing chess. A garden visible through French doors. The name across the top read Oakridge Senior Living. I picked up the brochure and looked through it without hurrying. Nobody spoke. Then I set it down and looked at Reginald. He leaned forward with his hands folded on the table, the posture he probably used in presentations, controlled and reasonable, the face of a man delivering difficult news for someone else's benefit. "Leonard, we've been concerned about your situation for a while now. Living alone out there, maintaining that property on a fixed income, it's a lot for one person. Frankly, the upkeep has become a strain on the family, and we think it might be time to consider something more manageable." I said, "You mean the access road?" That stopped him. "I'm sorry, the Riverside Legacy Project. My land sits directly on the only viable access route to the northern section of the development." "That's what this dinner is about." Howard cleared his throat. Gloria straightened in her chair. Reginald's practiced expression held for another few seconds, and then something behind it shifted. "You're being asked to consider what's best for the whole family," Howard said. His voice had that measured boardroom weight to it. "This development represents generational opportunity. Sometimes personal attachments have to give way to larger realities. Margaret bought that land," I said. "She worked nights for 3 years to afford it. She planted 12 trees along the east fence line. I'm not sure that qualifies as a personal attachment so much as a life." Reginald opened the manila envelope and spread several documents on the table. Power of attorney, a property transfer agreement, a consent form for a guardianship review. "These are straightforward," he said. "You sign the POA, we handle the sale, you transition to Oakridge. The facility is excellent. You'd have your own room, medical staff on site, activities, meals." I looked down the table at Nadine. She was staring at her hands. Her jaw was tight. She didn't look up. "Is this what you want?" I asked her. The room was quiet. Outside, a car passed on the street. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. Nadine picked up her wine glass and took a long sip and did not answer. I reached into my jacket pocket and took out my phone. Reginald laughed. It was short and dismissive, the kind of laugh that's meant to shrink you. "What are you doing calling a cab?" I didn't answer him. I pressed play on the voice memo I had recorded in Reginald's office on Tuesday afternoon. My own voice came out of the speaker first, calm and even, reading the email subject line aloud. Then I read the text of the message. The project manager's words filled the dining room. "The Whitfield parcel is the only remaining obstacle. Without the access road through that lot, the entire northern section is landlocked." Then Reginald's reply, "Work every angle. Offers, pressure, whatever it takes." I stopped the recording. Nobody moved. Gloria's hand was frozen around her wine glass. Howard had both palms flat on the table. Reginald's face had gone through several expressions in the space of about 4 seconds and had settled on something I hadn't seen on him before. It wasn't anger yet. It was the look of a man realizing the ground under his feet is not what he thought it was. I scrolled to the recording from the dinner and let 10 seconds of it play. Reginald's own voice, smooth and reasonable, laying out the terms of the power of attorney. Then Howard's voice. Sometimes personal attachments have to give way to larger realities. Then Gloria setting the Oakridge brochure on the table, the soft click of it against the wood. I stopped that one too and set the phone face up between the documents and the brochure. "I've been recording since I walked in," I said. "Everything said at this table tonight is documented. Clifford Hartley has copies of both files as of 10 minutes ago." Reginald stood up. His chair scraped back hard against the floor. "That recording is inadmissible. Illinois is a two-party consent state. You can't use that. Illinois requires consent from all parties for private conversations, I said. A dinner table with 5 people present is not a private conversation under the statute. Clifford already checked. But even if it were, what's on that recording is sufficient probable cause for a criminal investigation into elder financial abuse, which is a Class 2 felony in this state. You can argue the admissibility question with a judge if you'd like. He looked at me for a long moment, then he said, "Sign the papers, Leonard. This doesn't have to go any further. I'm not signing anything tonight," I said, "but I'm making a phone call." I dialed Clifford and put it on speaker. He answered on the first ring. "Leonard Cliff. Activate Clause 17 of the LW Capital Shareholder Agreement. Freeze all Osworth Construction assets pending emergency board review. Prepare termination documentation for the Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately. Already drafted and ready to file. Board meeting is confirmed for tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. Lorraine Hollis and Philip Brannigan have both confirmed attendance. Full board will be present. Thank you, Cliff. One more thing. Do you need anything else tonight?" I looked across the table at Reginald, who was standing with one hand on the back of his chair, not quite holding himself up and not quite standing on his own. "No," I said. "I think we're done here." I ended the call. Howard made a sound low in his throat. "LW Capital," he said, almost to himself. Then he looked at me directly for the first time all evening. Really looked, and I could see the moment it landed. "Leonard and Margaret. L&W, you borrowed $280 million in 1994 to keep the company alive," I said. "I gave you that runway. I gave you 30 years of silent partnership and never asked for a seat at your table or credit for a single contract. That $280 million is worth $5 billion today. And you used 6 years of Sunday dinners and one Friday night to try to steal my wife's land so your son could build a glass tower on it." Howard didn't say anything. He looked older than 74 right then. Reginald found his voice again. It had less force behind it. "Now I'll fight this. Wrongful termination. Shareholder overreach. I'll have lawyers on this by morning." "You're welcome to," I said. "You'll be funding that lawsuit from personal assets since the corporate accounts are frozen as of tonight. Clifford has already contacted the other board members. The vote tomorrow is a formality." I picked up my phone and put it back in my jacket pocket. I pushed back my chair and stood up. Nadine was still at the table. She hadn't moved since I started the recording. Her wine glass was empty. She was looking at the tablecloth. I stopped beside her chair on my way out. "I'm not angry with you," I said quietly, "but I need you to understand what happened here tonight, and I need you to think about it on your own, without him in the room." She didn't look up. But she nodded, just barely, and I saw her jaw tighten the way it used to, when she was a kid trying not to cry. I said, "Good night" to the room. Nobody responded. The cab I had prearranged was waiting at the end of the driveway. I got in and gave the driver my address and watched the lit windows of the house get smaller through the rear window until we turned onto the main road and they disappeared. I was home by 9:30. I made a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table and listened to the river. The board meeting the next morning took less than an hour. I wore a dark suit, the only one I owned, bought for Margaret's funeral and worn twice since. Clifford met me in the lobby of the Osworth Construction Tower at 8:45. He had 2 briefcases and the calm expression of a man who had prepared thoroughly and was not worried about the outcome. We rode the elevator to the top floor. The boardroom was a long room with floor-to-ceiling windows on 2 sides and a rosewood table that seated 12. Lorraine Hollis was already there when we arrived. Along with Philip Brannigan and 5 other board members, they stood when I walked in, not out of ceremony. Out of something closer to relief, Lorraine had been a board member for 11 years and had watched Reginald's tenure with increasing concern. She had called me the previous night after Clifford briefed her, and the first thing she said was that she was glad someone had finally done something. Philip said roughly the same thing in fewer words. Reginald arrived at 9 with Howard beside him and a lawyer I didn't recognize trailing behind. Reginald had made an effort with his appearance, but his eyes were tired and there was a tightness around his mouth that no amount of preparation could smooth over. Howard walked slowly. He looked like a man carrying something heavy that he had no way to set down. Clifford presented the case in order. The email thread from Reginald's laptop, the dinner recording. The legal analysis establishing that the conduct at the table Friday night met the threshold for elder financial abuse under Illinois statute. The documentation showing that Reginald had directed company resources toward a personal acquisition scheme that used his executive position as leverage. Each board member had a printed copy of the materials in front of them. The room was quiet while Clifford spoke. Nobody interrupted. When he finished, Lorraine Hollis looked down the table at Reginald and said, "Do you have anything to say before we vote?" Reginald's lawyer leaned over and said something in his ear. Reginald shook his head once and said nothing. Lorraine moved for immediate termination of Reginald Osworth as chief executive officer. Philip seconded. The vote was 8-0. Howard abstained. His board advisor position was terminated by separate motion, also unanimous. Reginald sat without moving for a moment after the vote. Then he looked at me from the far end of the table. I built that company, he said. For 4 years I built it. Your father built it, I said. You ran it. There's a difference. He didn't have an answer for that. Security came at 9:47 and walked him and Howard to the elevator. The lawyer followed with his briefcase. The doors closed and that was the end of it. Lorraine was named interim CEO that same morning. Her first decision was to commission a redesign of the Riverside Legacy Access Plan. 3 months later, the revised proposal routed the entrance road along the northern boundary of the property rather than through it. The development broke ground in the spring. The land along the South Fork stayed exactly as it was. The city approved a proposal in March to establish a public walking path along the river frontage. They named it the Margaret Whitfield Riverside Trail. I found out by letter. I read it twice and then set it on the kitchen table and went outside and stood on the back step for a while. I didn't have much to say about it. It seemed right. It seemed like something she would have appreciated more than I could put into words. Nadine knocked on my door on a Saturday morning in April. No call ahead. She was wearing a plain cotton jacket and her hair was pulled back without any particular care. She looked like she had been sleeping poorly for a while, which I suspected was accurate. She said she was sorry, not for leaving Reginald. She was clear on that, said it was the right decision, and she had made it herself. She was sorry for Friday night. For sitting at that table and not speaking when I looked at her and asked her directly. I told her I understood why she hadn't. Fear is a reasonable response to a situation like that. It doesn't make it right, but it makes it human. We sat on the back porch with coffee and talked for 2 hours. About Margaret mostly. About the early years when the three of us would drive out on weekends and work on the house. Nadine handing nails up to me while I worked on the roof framing. Margaret marking measurements on boards with a carpenter's pencil she kept behind her ear. Nadine said she hadn't thought about those days in a long time. I told her I thought about them most mornings. She didn't ask me for anything. She didn't hint at her circumstances or suggest I might help with rent or make any reference to money at all. She just sat and drank her coffee and looked out at the river, and at one point she said, "Mom really did pick the best spot." I said she really did. Some men spend their whole lives making noise about what they have. Margaret and I decided early on that what we built was ours, and that the people who needed to know would know when the time came. That time came on a Friday night in November, and it went the way it was always going to go. You don't have to announce what you're worth. You just have to be ready when someone makes the mistake of assuming you aren't worth anything at all. If this story meant something to you, pass it on to someone who needs to hear it. And if you've got something worth protecting, don't wait for someone to come after it before you decide to stand up for it. Like and subscribe, and come back for more stories about the people who built something real and refused to let it be taken.